There is a monster staring at you, deep inside a vault. What had once been human now completely fused with machinery and metal. His body has merged with the vault structure around him. His throne is built from the biological matter of people he absorbed years ago. The voices of those people are still in there with him, overlapping and competing, and he has been this way long enough that he considers it normal. He wants to save humanity by remaking it in his own image, and he genuinely cannot understand why you would object. That is Fallout. That is what the original game was. At its core, underneath the dark humor and the retrofuturist aesthetic and the bottle cap economy, it was a horror game. Not entirely, and not always, but there was something genuinely disturbing running through the bones of the original Fallout that later entries in the franchise softened, redirected, and eventually almost lost. And the process by which that happened is one of the most interesting stories in the franchise's history. So today, we will explore the story of how Fallout left its horror roots behind, what it found in their place, and what it never quite managed to replace. Where it started. Fallout 1 was released in 1997, developed by Interplay Entertainment and led by Tim Kaine as creator, producer, and lead programmer. The game Kaine and his team made was not designed to be a horror game in any formal sense. It was designed to be a post-apocalyptic RPG with moral ambiguity at its center, drawing on tabletop influences, classic science fiction, and the specific visual language of 1950s Americana colliding with nuclear devastation. The dark humor that became one of the franchise's defining characteristics came, by Kaine's own account, largely from the team trying to make each other laugh during development. The Radiation King television brand, the Nuka-Cola Corporation, the Vault Boys' cheerful thumbs up in the face of everything were not calculated tone decisions so much as shared jokes that made it into the final product. But underneath all of that in the game's lore, and sometimes right on the surface of it, was something genuinely unsettling. The Mariposa military base, where the FEV experimentation had been happening before the war, was designed as a claustrophobic descent into evidence of atrocity. The more Mariposa you saw, the more obvious it was that whoever worked there had done something to people that was recorded by bureaucratic wording in the terminals and the mutant soldiers that you were fighting against. But this only made it worse, rather than better. The horror there was not that a creature would jump out from the closet. It was the gradual realization of all that a functioning organization could do for its military goal. And then there was the Cathedral, the living grounds of all sorts of abominations. The Cathedral in the Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, was the Master's base of operations, and the location of the game's final confrontation. Getting to it required working through the Children of the Cathedral, a cult that worshipped the Master as a divine figure, and operated as a legitimate charity organization in the surface settlements, providing medical aid while quietly funneling victims to the vats below. The children walked among ordinary wastelanders, smiled, offered help, and reported back. The horror of that, the way it made ordinary kindness suspect, was never fully spelled out by the game. It was just there in the structure, waiting to be remembered by anyone paying attention. Below the cathedral was the demonstration vault that the Master had converted into his throne room, and below that was the Master himself, Richard Grey, a man who had fallen into the FEV vats and been remade over years into a psychic mass of merged flesh, machinery, and partially absorbed human beings who still spoke through him in fragments. The walls of the vault were organic. Things moved in them. The screaming that came from the structure was not always identifiable as human. Tim Kaine's team may have never intended it, having some of their decisions on the setting and development being made just for the laughs, but they ended up making one of the most viscerally disturbing final bosses in the history of role-playing games. Those two things coexisted in Fallout 1 in a way that made the game genuinely unlike anything else. The dark humor did not undercut the horror, and the horror did not drag down any of the humor, creating in this contrast an atmosphere that's unique to the very first game of the franchise. They operated in the same space without canceling each other out, and the balance they struck gave the original game a range that the series spent the next 20 years trying with varying success, as we will see, to replicate. The transition point. Fallout 2 was released in 1998, developed by Black Isle on the same engine as the first game, and it is the entry in the franchise that the horror conversation tends to skip over, which is actually a mistake. Fallout 2 leaned harder into the dark humor and the irreverence than the original. original. The cultural references were more overt, the tone was broader in places, and the game had a confidence about its own weirdness that came from the first game having found an audience. But it also had some of the darkest material in the entire franchise buried in its content, and it did something that no other entry in the series has quite matched, which was to make the horror feel systemic rather than local. The Enclave in Fallout 2 was not presented as a faction with a competing ideology worth understanding. It was presented as the concentrated residue of everything that had been worst about the pre-war United States, preserved in a bunker and an oil rig, pursuing the same logic of control and experimentation that had caused the war in the first place. Their plan to release an airborne FEV strain that would kill virtually every living person in the wasteland was not a mustache-twirling villain scheme. It was a policy decision, made by people in suits in a conference room, authorized through a chain of command, and executed by soldiers who were following orders. The horror of the Enclave in Fallout 2 was not what they were willing to do. It was in how comfortable they were with the idea of committing mass genocide, the new Reno content, the slavery mechanics, the way the game presented a post-war world where most of the exploitation that had characterized the old world had simply resumed under different branding. All of it sat in the same tonal space as the first game, dark enough to mean something, leavened enough to keep moving through. The balance was still there in Fallout 2, but what happened next is where things truly began to change. The handover. Interplay Entertainment began to sell the Fallout intellectual property to Bethesda Softworks in 2004, after years of financial difficulty that had steadily dismantled the studio that made the original games. Black Isle Studios had already been shut down in 2003. The team that made Fallout 1 and 2 was dispersed. Some of them ended up at Obsidian Entertainment, which Fergus Urquhart founded with several other Black Isle alumni in 2003, while others scattered across the industry. Bethesda acquired the rights to develop Fallout 3, with Interplay retaining the rights to develop an online game for a limited period, and began work on what would become a complete reimagining of how the franchise operated. The change was not just about tone, it was about architecture, since Bethesda made open-world first-person RPGs, which was a completely different direction and step from the isometric games that originated the franchise. Oblivion was their reference point, the engine and the design philosophy that Fallout 3 was built on top of. The isometric perspective of the original games, which had allowed for a certain kind of environmental storytelling where you could see the whole picture of a scene from a distance and make your moral calculations before committing to an action, was gone. You were now inside the world in a way the first two games never quite put you. That change in perspective had consequences that nobody fully anticipated at the time. The horror of the original games was largely architectural. It lived in the structure of spaces, in the accumulation of evidence across a location, in the gap between what the surface presented and what you found when you went deeper. That kind of horror works in an isometric view, because you can read the whole room at once, process the relationships between objects and bodies and terminal entries, and understand the shape of what happened here before you move through it. In the first person, horror works differently. It is more immediate, more physical, more dependent on what you cannot see rather than what you can. The tools it requires are the tools of survival horror: sound design, lighting, pacing, the sudden appearance of something that was not there a moment ago. Bethesda knew how to build worlds, but whether they knew how to build horror in this new mode was something Fallout 3 would have to answer. The Dunwich Building. Fallout 3 was released in 2008 and was, by almost every commercial and critical measure, a massive success. It brought the franchise to a generation of players who had never touched the originals, established the Capital Wasteland as one of the most memorable game worlds of its era, and proved that the Fallout name could carry a first-person open-world RPG as successfully as it had carried isometric turn-based combat. The horror content in Fallout 3 did not disappear, but it did change in nature and in proportion. The game's default tone was a kind of post-apocalyptic melancholy rather than the acidic dark humor of the originals. The color palette was famously green, a choice that Tim Kaine mentioned he only noticed on a later date because of his color blindness, a fact that became a small piece of Fallout development folklore. The Capital Wasteland felt desolate and sad in a way that the original California Wasteland had not quite been, and that sadness was the game's primary emotional register. Horror Horror was not the default, but it was something you found. And when you did manage to come across it, though, Bethesda had done the work. The Dunwich Building is located at the far southwest corner of the Capital Wasteland map, miles from anything else, reachable only through deliberate exploration or through a specific quest added in the Point Lookout DLC. Ronald Laren in Girdershade will warn you about it if you ask. He calls it bad mojo and says he hears weird things coming from inside it, marking it on your map and very clearly preferring that you leave it alone. The building is a ruined pre-war office complex owned before the war by Dunwich Borers LLC, a drilling and excavation company. You descend through 3 sections: the entrance, the Forsaken Ruins, and the virulent underchambers. As you go deeper, the building goes darker, and the things that happen in it become harder to explain through any framework the game provides for understanding the wasteland. Objects move by themselves. Doors creak open when you walk past them. Footsteps sound nearby when nobody is there. When you cross a specific threshold in the Forsaken Ruins, you experience a hallucination of the pre-war period, seeing a man in pre-war clothing who, when the hallucination ends, has been replaced by a glowing feral ghoul. Audio logs left by a man named Jaime document his descent from a person looking for his father to something that can only repeat names in fragments of language. At the bottom, in a cave beneath the underchambers, is an obelisk with tendrils at its base, and a humanoid figure partially emerged from the stone, as though something is trying to get out. Feral ghouls worship it. The name repeated by a voice near the obelisk is Alhazred, the same name of the mad Arab author of H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon. The Krivbekni, a cursed book introduced in the Point Lookout DLC, connects to the obelisk and to an entity called Ugg-Qualtoth, whose nature the game never explains and whose presence the game never fully confirms. The Dunwich Building is the most direct horror experience in the post-Bethesda franchise, and it works precisely because it commits fully to the bit. It does not explain what is happening, nor does not give you a button to press to end the supernatural elements and receive a reward. It just puts you in a place where things are wrong in ways the wasteland does not normally allow for and leaves you to sit with that. But the Dunwich Building is also one location in a very large map. It is completely optional, out of the way. The rest of the game does not operate at its frequency. The Point Lookout DLC, released in 2009, extended the Dunwich mythology and also provided the closest thing the Bethesda era has to a sustained horror experience, with the swamp environment, the tribals, and the psychological manipulation sequence in the cerebral interface all pushing the game into territory the main campaign mostly avoided. But DLC is not the base game. It's additional content for players who wanted more, not the tonal foundation of the franchise, but Fallout 3 is far from being the only game that deals with this tone of the franchise in this way. A different perspective. Fallout New Vegas was released in 2010, developed by Obsidian Entertainment with a team that included several Black Isle alumni, and it is the game that most directly attempted to recover what the original entries had in terms of moral and tonal complexity. It did not recover the horror roots exactly, but it came closer than anything Bethesda had done with the franchise on its own. The base game of New Vegas was less interested in horror as a mode than the original games, but it was far more interested in the darkness that those games had treated as the baseline condition of post-war existence. The Legion crucified people on the road outside Nipton. The NCR's treatment of the powder gangers and the sharecroppers at Westside documented the ways that a functioning democracy could produce exploitation as efficiently as any authoritarian power. The tone was not comfortable, and it was not asking to be. The Dead Money DLC, the first major expansion for New Vegas released in December 2010, was something almost entirely different from any prior Fallout content. It was survival horror, not horror-inflected role-playing, not a scary location in an otherwise open world, but a sustained horror experience with specific survival horror mechanics. Limited resources, a collar detonation device that could kill you at any moment, an environment that would kill you if you stood in it too long, an antagonist designed around the specific tension of not being able to fight your way through every problem. The Sierra Madre, sealed behind its cloud of toxic gas, and populated by ghost people whose hazmat suits had bonded to their bodies after 2 centuries of exposure, was the most successfully realized horror environment in the entire franchise. The design philosophy was explicit. You could not not shoot your way out. Every instinct the rest of the game had been training you to apply was wrong here. You had to think, to move carefully, to accept that some things could not be resolved through combat. Dead Money won awards and sold well as DLC. The main game's fan response to it was divided, with a significant portion of players finding it too punishing and too far from what they had expected. That division is itself a piece of evidence about where the franchise's center of gravity had moved. The horror content that worked on its own terms was also the content that the broader audience found most alienating. Obsidian never made another Fallout game after New Vegas. The reasons for that are a separate story, but the tonal instincts they brought to the franchise, the willingness to treat the Wasteland as a place with real darkness rather than picturesque ruin, died with their involvement, but that wasn't the end of the franchise, and it would keep evolving and changing directions until another important change was made. The anticipated sequel to Fallout 3 was to be an action-driven game, an action game. Fallout 4 was released in 2015, and it is the game in the franchise that actually moved the furthest from the horror roots of the original. This is not a criticism of Fallout 4 as a game. It sold exceptionally well. It built a settlement system that gave players a creative outlet the series had never offered before, and its companion system was more emotionally developed than anything in prior entries. It did what it set out to do very effectively. What it set out to do was an action RPG set in post-war Boston, with crafting and base building and a voiced protagonist, and a story about a father looking for his son. The horror DNA that had been present in the original games was reduced to occasional set pieces scattered through an otherwise brightly lit and action-oriented experience. The Museum of Witchcraft in Salem is the most cited example, and it earns its reputation. You enter a building that has been systematically decorated by a deathclaw that has been using it as a nest, following a trail of increasingly disturbing evidence, before finally encountering the creature in a scripted horror sequence that the game stages with genuine care. It is well done, also contained in a single building with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The Dunwich Borers location in Fallout 4 continued the Lovecraftian thread from Fallout 3, with another descent into a space where something older and stranger than the wasteland seems to be present. The audio logs, the hallucinations, the hostile environment, all of it was there, but the location sat within a game world where the overall tone was brighter, the color palette was warmer, and the default mode of interaction was combat rather than dread. The horror content in Fallout 4 existed in spite of the game's overall tone rather than in harmony with it. In the original Fallout, the dark humor and the horror were two frequencies operating simultaneously, reinforcing each other. In Fallout 4, the horror genre was a guest in an action game's house. Part of this was structural. The voiced protagonist, Nate, or Nora, brought a pre-war identity and a specific emotional context to the game that made existential dread harder to sustain. A character with a voice and a backstory and a face on the loading screen is invested in a way that makes them actively resist being horrified. They have somewhere to be. They have a son to find. The passive, silent, player-defined protagonist of the original games was available to the horror in a way the sole survivor simply was not. The other structural factor was the settlement system. Building a home, placing lights and walls and turrets, establishing yourself as a physical presence in the landscape is the opposite of the psychological state that horror requires. Horror needs you to feel like you do not belong, but the settlement system wants you to belong completely, to own the land, to be safe in it. Those two things could not fully coexist. The tonal shifts were not the only thing that made the franchise so distant from its roots. At the core of the problem, we have got something more fundamental that is an appeal to the audience and a decision that changed everything. The development of an online multiplayer Fallout game. The multiplayer question. Fallout 76 was released in 2018 as an online multiplayer game, and whatever conversation about horror roots is happening across the franchise, Fallout 76 is usually largely outside it. An online game with other players present cannot sustain the atmosphere that the horror content in the series requires, because other players are moving through the same space with different intentions, different emotional registers, and a fundamental indifference to what you are trying to feel. The loneliness and the dread that the original games cultivated, and that even Fallout 3 and 4 could produce in specific locations, evaporates the moment another player's username appears above their head. Fallout 76 has horror content, the Torrance House, a location clearly referencing The Shining with a maze containing a skeleton holding an axe and blocks spelling out Redrum, is a diligent piece of work. The Mothman mythology running through the Appalachian wasteland builds a regional folklore that gestures toward the kind of cosmic unease the original games touched occasionally. occasionally, but the mode of the game works against all of it. Multiplayer presence, constant event notifications, the persistent cheerfulness of an online game designed to keep you playing and spending, these things are not compatible with the sustained atmospheric dread that the best horror content in the franchise required. Fallout 76 exists in a different genre from Fallout 1, and the horror DNA that survived the transition to first person in Fallout 3 did not survive the transition to multiplayer. How it happened? The question of why Fallout drifted from its horror roots is not difficult to answer, and the answer is not particularly sinister. The original Fallout was, in Tim Kane's own description, a B-tier side project at Interplay, made by a small team with modest expectations, intended for a niche audience of PC RPG enthusiasts who were already comfortable with morally complex content in their games. It sold better than expected, found a devoted following, and became influential beyond its commercial footprint, but it was never a blockbuster, and Fallout 2 sold similarly. The series was beloved by a specific community and largely invisible to everyone else. Bethesda bought the IP and made a game designed to be accessible to the audience that had loved Oblivion, which was a much larger and more diverse audience than the one the original games had. To do that, the game needed to be legible to players who had not spent hundreds of hours in isometric post-apocalyptic RPGs. It needed clearer objectives, more immediate feedback, a combat system that felt satisfying on a controller, and a world that rewarded exploration through spectacle rather than through the accumulation of moral and tonal complexity. Horror does not scale easily to mass audiences. It requires patience, investment, and a willingness to sit with discomfort that not every player brings to a game they bought to relax on a weekend. The humor of the franchise scaled, and the action and the world building all also scaled easily. The horror required work from the player that not everyone was prepared to do. There is also a first-person perspective problem that nobody fully solved. The horror of the original Fallout was cognitive and architectural, living in the structure of information and the shape of spaces as understood from a distance. Converting that to a first-person engine required either developing a new kind of horror appropriate to first-person play, as the Dunwich Building and Dead Money did, or losing the horror entirely. The games mostly did a bit of both, with horror surviving in specific locations designed for it while disappearing from the general tone of the world. And the franchise grew. The more people playing Fallout, the more diverse the demands on it, and the more pressure to prioritize the elements that appealed to the broadest possible audience over the elements that appealed to a specific kind of player who wanted to feel genuinely unsettled by a game they were playing for fun. What remains? The horror DNA of the original Fallout did not disappear entirely. It survives in specific locations, in specific pieces of writing, and in the structural darkness that the franchise cannot fully shed because it is built into the premise. The Vault experiments are the most persistent carrier of the original horror. Every Vault in the franchise is, at its root, a horror story, a group of people who trusted an institution with their lives and were used as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent. Vault 11, which the Courier can explore in New Vegas, demanded an annual human sacrifice from its own population on pain of everyone's death, and the terminal entries documenting how the community responded to that demand over generations are among the most disturbing pieces of writing in the franchise. That horror is not located in a jump scare or a flesh wall. It is located in documents, in the bureaucratic language of people recording what they had decided to do to each other and why. The environmental storytelling that Bethesda developed, the use of skeletons and objects and notes to reconstruct what happened in a specific location without ever telling you directly, carries some of the original game's horror instinct even when the overall tone has moved elsewhere. Finding the bed where two people clearly died together in a basement somewhere in the Commonwealth, with a note that explains nothing but implies everything, is a horror beat delivered without any of the genre machinery usually required for one. The Fallout TV series, particularly in its first season, recovered some of the original tonal range in ways the games after New Vegas had not. The cold, clinical horror of the Vault-Tec boardroom, where the executives discuss triggering nuclear war as a return on investment, operates in exactly the same register as the Enclave conference rooms in Fallout 2. It is institutional horror, the horror of ordinary people making monstrous decisions through professional means, and it lands with the same impact it always series did because the franchise never lost the capacity for it entirely. It just stopped using it as often. What was lost? What the franchise lost in leaving its horror roots behind was not just atmosphere. Bethesda's worlds are atmospheric, and it also couldn't be darkness. The Vault experiments are dark, even if it was not even horror specifically. What it actually lost was the specific quality the original games had of making you feel like the world you were moving through was not designed for your comfort. The retro-futurism and the dark humor were always in partial tension with the horror in Fallout 1 and 2, and that tension was productive. The cheerful Vault Boy grinning through a nuclear blast was funny and disturbing at the same time, and holding both of those responses simultaneously was exactly the emotional experience the game was after. Later entries resolved that tension in favor of the cheerful side. The Vault Boy is still on the merchandise and the loading screens, but the nuclear blast has gotten less threatening. The humor is still there, broad and accessible, but the thing it was in tension with has been softened into something more manageable. The Master talked to you for 20 minutes if you let him. He remembered being Richard Grey. He understood what he had become and could not stop being it. He was funny in a specific dark way, and he was genuinely horrifying, and both of those things were true at the same time. The franchise produced nothing quite like him again in the entries after New Vegas. And the reason for that is not that later developers were less talented, it is that the Master required a game willing to be unsettling at its center, and the franchise's center moved as the audience and gameplay did. The aftermath. The question that the franchise's drift from horror raises is not about whether the Bethesda-era games are bad games. They are certainly not. Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 are remarkable achievements in open-world design, and they brought the series to an audience that genuinely loves it. The question is whether something worth having was left behind in the process, and whether anyone will go back for it. The TV series suggests that someone understands what it was. The first season's pre-war sequences, the clinical boardroom horror of Vault-Tech's decision-making, the cold efficiency with which the show depicts the systemic evil of the institutions that caused the war, all of it reads like people who had studied the original games and understood which frequency they were broadcasting on. A Fallout game built on those instincts, with the production capacity that Bethesda now brings to the franchise and the tonal ambition that the original games had, would be something the series has not quite produced yet. Whether that game gets made depends on decisions being made in studio meetings that the people playing the games have no visibility into. But the original horror is still there in the archive, still playable, still doing what it always did to anyone willing to sit with it. There is still a man made of flesh and machinery at the bottom of a vault in the ruins of Los Angeles, and he is still asking you to consider his argument before you decide what to do about him. That is where the franchise came from, and everything that came after was built on the foundation that he represents, whether the later games knew it or not. If you've enjoyed this video and want to know about every Fallout protagonist explained and ranked in detail, click the video on the screen.